Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first event of the College Historical Society's 250th Anniversary Week. We're delighted to have you all here, especially representatives from universities across the world. So this is our opening event. It is an inter-university debate with teams from the UK, all across Ireland, in addition to the US, and so on. These are the prestigious institutions from around the world, and we're delighted to have them all here. And they have just completed a weekend of excellent debating on motions such as what capitalism does to modern society, as well as the quest for utopia and so on. So before we even begin, I'd like to give a round of applause to all of those competitors who have competed so ably this weekend. I would also like to ask that when all of the proceedings are finished and when we've completed the event with the President later this evening, that all competitors make their way up to the front of the room, please. So come up to this area and we'll take a group photograph. I think next I will delay as little as possible before we begin the debate, but the running order for this evening is we will have a debate with our wonderful finalists here representing Trinity, UCD, Harvard, Durham, and Oxford University. Once that debate is concluded, we will then go and have a brief intermission of about 15 minutes, so feel free to stretch your legs or talk to old honorary members that you haven't seen in a while and make new friends. After that, we'd ask that you take your seats again for maybe about 5 to 8, when we will welcome the President with a presidential salute from the organ above. Just to outline the standing orders for this evening, we are delighted to have Sophie Furlong Tighe, who convened this competition as timekeeper. Ian Ash will be in the chair. I will call him in a moment to the chair to introduce each speaker, and we have an excellent panel of judges. So starting from my left to go to right, Ted Smyth, who is a distinguished honorary member and former auditor of the Hist, will be involved on the judging panel. Marion, who's the CEO of Sipi Metals Corporation, is also there. Chairing the judging panel is Justice George Birmingham, who is President of the Court of Appeal. Caitríona and Bhriain, who is a representative of the Hist at the World University Debating Championships, and then Keegan Brennan, who was the convener of this year's Irish Times public speaking competition. And we would give all of our officiators of the event a round of applause too, if you don't mind. Thank you. Lastly, just some housekeeping rules. The first and last minute of each speech is what is called protected time, meaning that competitors can't offer each other points of information. And we would ask that no points of information be offered from the audience this evening. Speeches are 7 minutes in length, and time will be kept with a bell. Lastly, just pay attention to your emergency exits, and maybe don't shake hands so that this is not a public meeting for the sake of COVID-19. And without further ado, I will call Mr. Ian Ash, ex-Auditor of the 200th session, to the chair.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I call upon, from the TCD Hist, first for the proposition, Daniel Gilligan.
Can you hear me all right? Brilliant. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, it's a real honor to be here. In the 1840s, the constitutional democratic revolutions which swept across continental Europe were instigated by students, produced by a critical, reflective, imaginative university environment. In the 1960s, student protests from Paris to the United States, protests which revolutionized the thinking of a generation and made continued war an impossible proposition for one of the greatest military forces the world has ever seen, started in the classrooms, the teach-ins, the universities. In the 1990s, as the winds of democratic change blew across sub-Saharan Africa, from Senegal to Kenya to Ghana to Zambia, it was the academics and the students who made up the crowds and made the demands. It's also fitting on this day to remember Wolf Tone, produced by a university environment which was genuinely open and challenging, to a large extent made radical by the intellectual innovations of the Enlightenment. That was what universities could aspire to in the past. Those were the duties that they took upon themselves and which they fulfilled. Opposition might tell you that universities are doing okay at getting people into cushy grad jobs, or producing people or innovations which can make GDP grow year on year, or even creating a modicum of social mobility mind which is declining all over the developed world. We're willing to accept all of that. We're willing to accept that lots of people live nicer lives because of universities. That is not what this debate is about. This debate is about what a university can do and what a university must do. It's a debate about why universities exist and whether universities are fulfilling the duties which their place in society thrust upon them. It's a debate about why we don't just send people to 3 more years of school or to vocational training courses. We think universities, as suggested by the examples I've given above, have a duty to provide a foundation for critique of the way that we live our lives, the assumptions we have, and the questions we don't ask. Provide an environment and provide the tools to allow people to imagine what society might be like, to play an active part in public discussion, to lead on questions of public concern and public life, to, in short, speak truth to power or facilitate others in doing so. What are the powers in society that need a little truth speaking? An ideology, a way of viewing society which unites politicians, thinkers, business leaders, and to a large extent defines our age. An ideology which is made up of several different components. The first element of which is a dogmatic belief in the myth of linear technological progress as something which is natural, which is part of human destiny, and which is a virtue in and of itself. If only we create more and more things, we'll gradually, without any additional reflection, solve all of our problems and free ourselves from vice. That is a very recent idea. It's a 20th or 21st century idea. Related to that, we have a faith in an economic system that focuses pretty uncompromisingly on growth, and in order to do so, focuses on making an exceedingly small number of corporations and individuals very happy such that we can develop and fulfill the destiny which the prevailing ideology sets out for us. Those forces have created problems which are obvious to any thinking person. An environmental catastrophe caused and justified by continued technological innovation and economic growth on the backs of corporations immune to meaningful critique. Rapidly rising inequality, both within countries and between countries. Again, caused by economic systems which seek to keep those at the top happy and where meaningful innovation is monopolized in favor of the powerful, and the weak suffer what they must. A menu of quite likely dystopian futures where artificial intelligence leaves most of us unemployed, where foreign intelligence services can interfere incredibly efficiently in our domestic elections, and where governments throughout the world can know where their people are, who they meet, and what they think. What should a university be doing in this context? If anybody would like to offer me a point of information, absolutely.
According to your analysis, universities are symptomatic of a general societal failing rather than causing that failing.
What we would suggest is that the universities in the examples which I set out came from societies which they criticized, where they saw the assumptions which caused society to work in ways which they didn't like, and they actually challenged those assumptions. We would suggest that universities today are doing the very, very opposite. They are mirroring those societies when they don't have to mirror those societies, and in doing so, they're contributing to the social problems which those ideas cause. What should a university be doing in this context? What are the duties that it must perform? As I said earlier, it's contributing to a conversation about structures and the ideas which govern us. It's about being active in public discourse and highlighting injustices where we see them. It's about asking whether we are really on the right trajectory at all. What are the contradictions in the assumptions which we all believe? Speaking up for the people whose exclusion has produced a shared ideology which so evidently serves the interests of some people and not of others. In doing so, universities can be massively influential and can actually create change, and indeed, because of that, have a duty to try no matter what. Why is that? Because very seldom will anyone get time to think profoundly about these questions and research deeply about these questions unless they are given space which universities provide them. But also, universities are where impressionable people hear about ideas and experience a time where they think more deeply about how the world works than they ever have and probably ever will. So, that's what universities should do. What are they doing instead? They are mirroring society and its pathologies and are therefore contributing to them. Many of the university's employees may as well be corporate ones, or quite apart from corporations, may as well be the employees of whatever nefarious forces you could dream up of in the world. They produce drugs or robots at great expense to the taxpayer, which are then patented and sold back to that taxpayer at a premium. MIT scientists produce the facial recognition technology, which allows the Chinese government to see if you're a Uyghur Muslim so that they can put you in a concentration camp. Cambridge scientists work hand in hand with Cambridge Analytica so that they can steal ordinary Americans' personal data and sell it to the forces of crypto-fascism. The university's goal of teaching is essentially to create good corporate employees today. It's to create attributes or skills rather than ideas. Attributes or skills like reliability or sociability or resilience. Corporate mumbo-jumbo, which is shorthand for people who will work twice as hard and accept half as much. The prevailing model of research is one of production. It's about making something new, which means that the important questions which have divided people for generations are dismissed as questions which surely we know everything we could possibly know about them. And instead, people ask irrelevant questions. They shout in echo chambers instead of contributing to society in the way we think they should. This debate is about duties. They are far from being performed, proposed.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, I omitted to mention at the beginning, we have just heard the Daniel Gilligan propose that this House believes that universities are failing society. I now call upon, for the opposition, Shane Sweeney. Of the UCD Literary and Historical Society.
Ladies, gentlemen, Americans, we live in a society. A society that fails universities. That's right, I'm going to play a Uno reverse card and flip the motion on its head. The optimal purpose of a university is to pass on the specialist knowledge that it has accrued over time to the people who can use it the best, and to assure that all of the people who do need it can use it. That's what universities want to do. If you ask any academic, that's what they would say they want to do, but that's not what they're allowed to do under the status quo. That's not what society lets them do because of the narratives that societies push. Importantly, it's not to make everyone a university graduate. Universities don't want to equip everyone with the same types of skill sets and same amount of knowledge to a university level, because we don't think that's necessary for every profession in society, and I think I'll get into that a little bit more. But the problem is, society doesn't realize that that's what university is for. Society thinks that the purpose of a university is to find or create a genius, to push in as many people as possible in the hopes that one will be churned out to be a flashy, high-profile entrepreneur or millionaire or something like that. They want to do that instead of creating just classes of well-informed, astute, skilled workers who can slowly but steadily contribute to society. They're not interested in that. They want something that's high profile that they can point to as as a success of the university, not a slow change over time. And it is because they have this singular pursuit of a genius, or that they want to create these geniuses or genii or genopodes or whatever, that they fail. Because in that search for genius, they have to push certain narratives. They have to push the narrative that everyone needs to go to university in order to matter. The problem is that narrative isn't true. It isn't true because A, not everyone needs to go to university to matter, and B, some people can't go to university, but they can still matter. And it is those two kind of branches from the main crux of that narrative which will form the two branches of my speech. So what do I mean when I say lots of people don't need to go to a university? So number one, I think it's just true that like a lot of trade skills probably don't need to go to university, but that they are still like pretty essential to society. So like, I need my house to have good plumbing. That plumber doesn't need a good university degree, but he still needs to exist. But I also think this is true for people like nurses or teachers. Teachers don't need to know how to write essays. Nurses don't need to know how to, reference and research and stuff like that. They just need on-the-ground experience. The problem is when you force people into university who don't need to be in university, you get an awful lot of adverse effects. For number one, it just sort of puts a strain on those universities. It means that universities have to increase class sizes to the point where people lose out on one-on-one experience with their tutors. It means that you have to probably raise fees because you have to cope with, again, the increased demand of students. It means that you have to cut back on counseling services. It means that you have to rent gets higher because, again, there's an increased demand to live near there. But it also just means that those individual students are having a worse education. Again, because A, they're having like less one-on-one experience, but B, that because they're forced into courses that they probably don't need to do, an awful lot of them are just unhappy in their education. They're doing the wrong course and they're learning the wrong things and they're not happy. What happens when you have a generation of students who are not happy in what they're doing? You get a worse society because they have an awful lot of skills that they don't need. Society is wasting an awful lot of time on people that don't need it. And because of the failures in stuff like rent and counseling and stuff like that, it means you lock out an awful lot of students who could otherwise use it. In turn, society then gets mad because universities are failing, which is what Prop wants to say, and the society blames the universities. But you can't like blame someone if you have failed them. That is counterintuitive. But it also, so as well as harming the people within that university who are, again, going to harm society in turn, it harms all the people who can't get to university.
There is some question behind you.
Yes, Rory.
Even if a society is failing a university in every way, the university still has a duty to challenge that society. If I told the captain of a hurling team he was failing the hurling team, and he told me that the other players were playing badly too, that would not be a good enough response.
Okay, but if you're the manager of the hurling team and you're continually kicking the captain in the shin and then saying he's not playing well, I think that that's probably unfair. It's true that the universities aren't succeeding, but it's not them that is failing. So again, you get all of these people who are then locked out because of that increased demand for university and because they're told, and because of all of the other reasons that society has failed them. So for example, society just doesn't value kids in lower socioeconomic classes. An awful lot of kids don't even make it to like the end of their second level of education, let alone get into university. What happens to those kids? Number one, they're told that they don't matter because they don't have a university degree. They then in turn, because of the narrative that you don't matter if you have a university degree, that has two effects. On those kids, it means that they're told that they don't matter, so they don't try to aspire to get into university. And number two, it means that society as a whole thinks that these classes of, like these socioeconomic classes of children don't matter. So they're less likely to invest in those children. What happens then is that this lower socioeconomic class of children don't get into university. And you lock out an awful lot of very clever, very brilliant people who could contribute to society in huge ways, but do not have that, the formalized education that they need in order to do that. Because, who knows how many, massive breakthroughs that could be achieved by people who simply never get the chance, who are never given the tools. And again, it is not the purpose of a university to make sure that, schools in lower socioeconomic classes are succeeding. It's not the purpose of a university to keep kids from straying from a value of education. It is the purpose of society. It is the purpose of government policy. It is the purpose of our culture to value people like that. What happens then is means that the university is then left with an awful lot of specialist knowledge that they want to pass on to people, but they can't because those people are not coming to see them. So what happens to that specialist knowledge? It is used to make the most privileged people in society feel smart. It is used to be able to enable the 1% to say, look at me, I have a degree from Harvard, and I am therefore special. It means that you lock out all of these people who are equally as brilliant, who can never do that. It means that those people are then either locked inside a classroom that they don't enjoy doing a course that they hate, or they're locked outside of a classroom that is too expensive or that does not match their needs. It is true that universities are not succeeding, but it is not the fault of universities. It is the fault of a society who is failing to enable them to give people the power that they deserve and the power to contribute in the way that they are best suited to do. Thank you. Please oppose.
To propose the motion, I call upon Aisling Kinsella from the Literary and Historical Society, UCD.
Our story starts 1,161 years ago in Fez, Morocco, when the first scholars came together to found what would become the University of Caitríona, the world's oldest university. 250 years isn't still impressive, though, the Hist, so congratulations. I am sure they were humbled by the promise of what the university could grow to become, a place of thinkers with the time and the smarts to dedicate to the pursuit of knowledge, who were unrestricted by the bounds of normal life, of commerce and existence, with the capacity to further humankind. Now, in 2020, as students sit in the Accenture Theatre of the Dennis O'Brien Centre for Science, studying networking skills for synergy advancement, I'm sure these fine scholars are glad to see their dreams realised. For my friends here from Oxford and Harvard, if you don't know who Dennis O'Brien is, I'm sure you've met his kids on campus. In order for university to be considered a failure to society, they can't just be accused of producing annoying intellectual lads from BESS. That's business, economics, socializing, and scintillating conversation no one knows. They have to be failing to discharge a duty to society. So what is the duty that is unique to universities? Universities are in a unique position as contributors to discussion, conductors of research and sources of education and knowledge, which crucially do not have an agenda. They are not pro one political party or ideology like think tanks might be. They are not single-minded in their goals like lobby groups might be, and they don't have to answer to shareholders like businesses do. We acknowledge that universities work within strict and small budgets, but we don't think the problems and failings we see now are caused by them just passively going along with what society has been doing. These trends were created by active decisions, by not pushing back hard enough or long enough against cuts, and by becoming reliant on corporations to the extent that they've given the government no reason to change the status quo because they appear to be sufficient. So what is the status quo that we see at the moment? Because we are witnessing an alarming trend in universities which undermines their status as agenda-free contributors to society. They are increasingly acting like businesses in two key ways. They are becoming commercialized, corporate funding for research and PhDs, sponsoring buildings, and driving up corporate participation in things like open days and internships. Reliance on corporations has become the modus operandi for universities. No, thank you. And this has been reflected in how they conduct themselves. In order to attract investment, they aim to move up meaningless rankings and focus almost exclusively on artificial key performance indicators. Although I hear Trinity is currently doing exceptionally well on the MUMPS index. And don't worry about that though, if you don't know what I'm referring to, I'm sure you're fine. This is bad for students, as it has come at the expense of contact hours, of prioritization of the student experience, and is emblematic of an attempt to management consultant the learning experience. Secondly, no thank you. They treat students as customers and cater to students who make the best customers. And for those of you with a business degree in the audience, I'm sure you know that means the people with the most money. They try to attract them by providing flashy facilities like swimming pools and a proper sense of arrival by building a €4 million gate outside of UCD. The same gate outside of which students are now sleeping in tents in protest of a 12% increase in rent on campus, which would render them homeless. No thank you. Not to mention those students with 4-hour round-trip commutes to college, for those from low-income backgrounds who are forced to work through the night to the extent that they fall asleep in lectures in the morning. Instead of providing online classes, reducing rent, providing easier access to faculty supports and health supports, universities tell students in need that these problems are their own to deal with. You signed up, you weren't invited here. This trend develops into who applies for postgrad opportunities, who joins your faculty, who contributes most to the output of the university. It becomes more and more homogenous. This has resulted, I'll take them in a second, thank you. This has resulted in two main changes from the universities of past, or the ideal university. They are increasingly attached to and in the pockets of corporations, and they are becoming less accessible, meaning that the student population and the ideas that they produce and send into the world are becoming more homogenous. Now, opening opposition say to us, no thank you, society are making more people to go to university. It's actually society that's failing university and not the other way around. Why do you think people believe they need to send all their kids to university? It's because universities target them because that's what the business model is. And universities can just not accept too many people if it's going to run down those students, but they don't because they know they'll pay fees. Your argument actually is an argument for profit. Before I go on, I will take closing.
My mum cobbled together what little savings she had so that I could go to university in pursuit of an employable job. Why do you deny me that right in pursuit of lofty academia?
No one is denying people the right here. I just think that they should increase the amount of people who they accept on lower increase the subsidies, decrease points. No one is saying that people don't have a right to go to universities. But all of these trends I've identified has resulted in universities having a de facto agenda. How? Firstly, what they are capable of researching, publishing, and publicly discussing has changed. From commercialization and the pressure to attract and satisfy corporations, there are pushes for academics to publish in commercial-minded publications and fields, and also to hire academics with the capacities to do so. You're not going to attract KPMG sponsorship with your slam and existential philosophy department, and so this pushes limits the types of experts which are created within universities. Moreover, when the student body becomes more and more homogenous, they're from the same social class, went to the same schools, have the same lived experience, naturally the type of worldview they bring to the discussion in university is more similar than if it's more accessible and you have people who have more lived experiences. This creates an internal implicit bias and therefore an agenda to the work which is published when there is no countervailing opinion. But also, how universities contribute to public discussion has changed. They stay reasonably quiet on issues relevant to their key donors, either because there's no research on critiquing them or any findings they do run the risk of losing further funding. That even goes so far as to allowing the authoritarian government of China spend €5 million building a Confucius Institute in UCD, whose sole purpose is to ensure there is as little criticism of Chinese human rights abuses as possible. €5 million, it also appears, is the price of UCD's soul. Universities owed us a duty. They owed us free thinkers. They owed us an independent voice. They owed people with few opportunities access to the halls of power. Instead, they built a €4 million gate in front of it, which none of them were able to get through. They have failed on all accounts.
The second person to oppose the motion that this House believes that universities are failing society is from Oxford Union, Oscar Sherry.
If I speak like this, can everyone hear me without the microphone? No? Okay, I'm going to use the microphone then. Wonderful. See, universities teach you things all the time. In India right now, students are protesting the citizenship bill and operationalizing to prevent unlawful detention. In Egypt 2 years ago, they acted against martial law and shut down the government. In Thailand, electoral corruption was frozen and re-elections were initiated because of the students at the University of Bangkok. In Brazil, students right now are protesting environmental degradation and making sure it does not continue. And in Chile, the flagrant economic mismanagement is being presented by students on the streets, paralyzing the government acting along their merry way. I was so confused when opening government wanted to tell me that the social change that universities have and have always done does not occur in the 21st century. Those 5 examples should be enough to take out their assertive case, but going beyond that, I'm going to give real analysis as to why universities have, are, and will always provide that social change that we want to hear. To take out a few extraneous points of rebuttal, we hear from the Prime Minister, research is used for evil. I think it is ridiculous that government expect us to A, allow universities to control their research, and then down the chain allow universities to control everything that research is used for. I don't think facial recognition was designed by universities with racist purposes in mind. I think it was designed for a bona fide good that was then operationalized. And what's more, universities often protest the most for these inventions going against the aims stipulated. In Australia, the selling of GM cotton patents to Monsanto is met with absolute uproar at the chemistry faculties of Sydney and Melbourne. On closing government, I posed a POI in response to their case of lofty academia and didn't really hear an answer, because the reason that we have not so much, contact hours, for example, is because university is more accessible. It's not just for the elite, it's not just pay your way. There is fewer money to go around. People are also entitled to employability, which also allows universities to cater to that. I'm not sure where government thinks that the money is going to come from. And I think if they're attacking things like Confucius Institutes, it's because universities are so desperate to cater to their incorrect demands that they are forced to go to sources like the Confucius Institute because there is not enough money under the status quo to meet unrealistic outcomes. What is the case of this debate? The case of this debate is that universities, A, are uniquely good at cultivating socially beneficial ideas. That is an implicit assumption from the past OG make, but I'm going to tell you why it happens now. And secondly, universities uniquely take these ideas, coalesce them, and turn them into action particularly well. Why are universities good at cultivating these socially beneficial ideas? I would say a large amount of social ills around the world stem from lies, fear, and misinformation. You are told outsiders are the enemy. You are told that things like being gay is contagious, and that feminism will break down society and destroy the family. Maybe not such extreme propositions, but even in the UK, you are told austerity is the only way because every other country that doesn't do it is going under. Universities are often the only actors that can break this misinformation and turn this truth realization into action and a social stance. Firstly, why are universities good at gathering this information? And this affects autocracies particularly, I'm going to tell you why, but also affects everyone, like UK austerity example. Firstly, research outcomes, which are good, even if it's for profit, like OG wanted to tell you, rely on collaboration, cooperation, and the cross-fertilization of ideas. Even in the most repressive regime, which shuts off trade links, there is even more of a demand to innovate nationally, which means you have to produce research. That means that you are forced to collaborate with people from other countries, even the countries that you always said were the enemy, countries with female researchers where you are told that women can't go to school, women can't go into academia. That looks like exposure to the work of outsiders, less censorship in university internet servers, foreign academics, sending people to conferences, student exchanges. These are all things we take for granted but make a massive difference in promoting this truth. It's less of a fear of otherness and exposure to countries that do what you've been told to fear. You don't fear women's suffrage because you visited a country where women have the vote, where women can drive, where women can do anything they want to, and that society has not fallen apart. In fact, you are reliant on their research. I'll note that the few people that got exit visas after the Prague Spring, which was indeed caused by student protests, were scientists because the Eastern Bloc knew that was the only way to get research out. But also, I'll take you later, this turns into a platform of change. And just some reasons for this. Students, by the very nature of teaching, irrespective of how bad that teaching is, are taught to be curious, skeptical, and challenge authority. Students live together, they work together, and they face social problems for the first time because they are out of their parents' home. And also, students are usually in this excellent position where they are close enough to information to know what's going on, where the problems come from, but often not elite enough to still be discontent. They're poor. In the 80s, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, all came from this information coming in. But even the fee protests in South Africa come because South African students knew that it was not irrational to expect the government to provide free education because they had the way to see that other countries did it and were able to do it well, quickly.
So you seem to think that it's the students who go to universities that are great at making these big social changes. But if they now have to work all days and nights in order to afford to go, how do they have time to protest?
Why are universities the unique sites that action these ideas well in direct response to that POI? 3 reasons. They are firstly unique sites of prestige because they are associated with development, because research is good and often well funded, and because the elites in countries often come from these very universities. That is why Tiananmen Square was so powerful at coalescing international attention, because it was students from Peking and Tsinghua who were in the square who got kettled and who had to face repression. Secondly, you have influence over other influential people. Academics are in the government, they're in cabinet, they're in think tanks. But when you are taught by academics, you have a link with them to make them sympathetic to your cause. In India, law students have now set up a register of law professors who will challenge unlawful detention by the Modi government. You don't get this in any other atmosphere. But finally, students are uniquely able to translate grievances into good because they have the expertise not just to say this is a problem, but to say this is a problem and this is how countries that I have learnt from turn that into solutions. That means they are more realistic goals, they are more palatable goals, and they are also goals that lead to the negotiating table which gets the change we all agree want to happen. I'm incredibly proud to oppose this motion.
And now I call upon to propose the motion from the University of Durham, Ren Tilbury.
When I was invited to come and speak at this event a few weeks ago, it was one of the greatest honors of my life. Not only because I could come and speak with and against some of the greatest student orators in the world, but because I could come and speak in the name of Edmund Burke, one of my personal heroes. I think that Edmund Burke is part of a long legacy of something that is unfortunately dead in the modern university, the role of the public intellectual. I think that this role has been usurped, stolen from the universities who are best able to provide this kind of guidance. Instead, I think that we are sold the peddled rubbish of individuals like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson, people who appeal to mass populism but are unable to provide the good advice and the sensible policy that we so desperately need in our troubled times. I think that there is one reason why this has occurred, and it is going to make up the core of my speech, because I think that it inherently tackles the cases that opposition have brought you today, and it strengthens the cases that my colleagues on government have brought you. Namely, that universities as a whole, both their student bodies and the academics, have closed up their gates, have sealed an ivory tower against the auspices of those from outside the academic circles, and that this has led to the greatest disaster of split consciousness in our society and of any time ever. Before I go into my case, yes.
Bren, if unis are a waste of time and they're failing, how do you suppose I break it to my ma that she's wasted a load of money on all of us going to college?
I suggest you apologise and you promise to do better. I enjoy the fact that you laugh. I think that that's a good sign in a debate, but I don't think that this is a laughing matter. Because I think, no, seriously though, I think that the degree of divide between those of us who have the privilege, something that is necessarily a privilege, given the humongous costs and effort it takes to come into university, the inherent biases of university admission boards that prevent the most marginalized individuals from ever entering, I think the fact that we have an air of superiority within these universities is disastrous. I'd like to show what the counterfactual is before these times, because I think in the past we didn't think that the only knowledge that was worthwhile was found within the circles of academia. When I write my papers for my philosophy course, and when my friends also write their papers for all of their courses, we are told explicitly that the only viable knowledge, the only reference that we are allowed to give in these papers are from other academics, people already brought in to our privileged circle. Only those bits of knowledge are legitimate, only those bits of knowledge are valuable. Better were the days, I say, when university academics went and interacted with the real world. A number of examples here. Jeremy Bentham, one of my favorite philosophers ever, who went out into the world, experienced and understood the issues of regular people, and took those insights into providing criticism and to explaining to people the sheer plight of the workhouse. That led to the end of the workhouse. I think that society was better for it. I think the comparison now is that when we draw out answers from one singular source, those answers are stale and those answers are out of touch with the questions that regular people are asking. The questions that we answer today are not the questions that are meaningful to individuals. I think there is a deep existential problem of the post-industrial age, and I think that the questions universities are answering with their huge investments in STEM research, their ignorance of the humanities and social sciences through defunding and just straight up ignoring them all the time because no one likes the preachy academics from the philosophy courses like me. I think that this failure means that we continue to perpetuate a cycle of technological progress that has not served the regular individuals, that continues to fail them and continues to provide an absolutely dreadful degree of suffering. I think that makes my case. If anyone wants to offer a POI against it, I will let them do so now. No, wonderful. Let's bully the opposition teams a bit. Right, I think firstly, the two opposition teams are necessarily in clash with one another. Opening opposition tells you that universities are being failed by society because there is a social narrative that everyone should be going to universities and thus too many people are coming in. On closing, they then come to you and tell you separately that the issue is that we are not allowing enough marginalized individuals into our universities, that we should be admitting more people. These two ideas cannot coexist at the same time. They need to pick one. At the point at which they can agree between themselves which one it is, I think we are better equipped to tackle that issue. I think, nonetheless, some rebuttal to both sides of that. Firstly, to opening. With regards to the issue of too much access, if universities really, truly believed that there were too many people coming in, that this was ruining their ability to do their duties, that the social narrative was somehow being the disastrous failure of society to universities, I think they could admit less students. It's not hard. I think the reason why they don't do this is because they are greedy and they like having money. At the point at which vice-chancellors at my university and hundreds of others around the globe are drawing 6- and 7-figure salaries, I think it is really weird for opening to come up and claim that this is societal narratives at work rather than the simple greed of greedy business people. With regards to closing, I think that the better time was in the past when we actually listen to those from marginalized communities. Because I think even if we have a handful more people from minority backgrounds coming in and being able to achieve degrees, I don't think this is commensurate to the vast number of the impoverished, the vast number of others from these marginalized communities who are directly ignored. Better were the days when university academics went out into the world and interacted with the people they found there. Look, if there's one thing you take away from this speech and from this case, it is that universities have a duty to people outside of their walls. It is this duty that we, as a whole, have most egregiously failed at. I am not proud to stand on proposition. I am ashamed, and I think we all should be too. Nonetheless, I think that I am right, and rightness will win this debate. Thank you.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, the individual who will oppose the motion is from Harvard, Benjamin Hoffner-Brodsky.
I'd like to begin by thanking the chair. You have supported me and had my back for the last half hour. Despite the lack of cushioning, I've really enjoyed sitting on your soft blue seat. But on a more serious note, I'd like to issue a huge thank you to the Historical Society and all of the other debaters involved. Though as an overworked student, I did initially struggle to think of examples of how universities could possibly benefit society, the incredible displays of public intellectual thought on pressing issues that I've seen this weekend give me hope that I may even be debating on the right side of this issue. Lastly, it's worth noting that though I do strongly believe that universities are in fact on balance contributing to society, there are some notable exceptions that I would never attempt to contend. The most notable of which, represented in the audience, is Yale University. I'm still struggling to think of a single contribution that they've made. But it's possible that this is a more pressing issue to debate now than any time in recent history. Universities today are under threat. They're under threat from populist governments that are cutting their funding around the world in many countries in Europe. The public is turning against the ivory tower. But unlike closing opposition, I don't blame the public for this. I blame the institutions. Not for the lack of incredible work that they're doing for society, but perhaps universities have never done as much for the world as they're doing today.
Point.
But because that work is no longer as visible as it used to be. The effect of universities on public life is no longer Plato standing in the public square expressing his ideas for all to see. It's incredible research being done behind closed doors that affects all of our lives, whether or not we see it. It's advisors that are creating policies that make the world a better place, even if the faces of those policies are the politicians that pass them, rather than the universities that designed them. So what I'm going to prove to you today is that universities are doing a better job than ever before of satisfying their obligation to society, of ensuring that the knowledge that they create within the ivory tower is actually benefiting everyday people and making it to those who need it the most. I'll talk to you today about the research that universities produce and the necessary societal roles that they fill. That which most distinguishes universities from other forms of higher learning and trade schools is the incredible research being done within their doors. Oftentimes, this takes the form of advisors that are showing people the best ways to create policies and run institutions. None of us appreciate, for example, that the only ways that our economies are able to function is because of central bank advisors trained at universities who we've never heard of, will never see on TV, but whose role plays a massive role in all of our lives. In Europe right now, we're seeing the first ever incidence of things like zero and negative interest rates. In the absence of university professors dedicating their lives to trying to understand how we ought to respond to these new threats and challenges, it's possible that we would be in recessions today. Recessions that the public can never begin to imagine because professors around the world are solving them before we ever see them. When we think about the ways that we engage in foreign policy and in conflicts overseas, we know the ways in which our politicians talk to other politicians on TV, but what we don't see are the university professors advising politicians, advising think tanks, and figuring out what types of interventions are going to work, doing the research to find out how we can best be contributing to the world, and making sure that we're acting intelligently and not just based off rash intuition. But most of this incredible research comes in the forms of incredible innovations. Flu shots that have saved millions throughout history were invented at the University of Rochester. Solar panels, one of our greatest assets in the fight against climate change, possibly the greatest threat facing humanity, were invented in the halls of MIT. Even seatbelts weren't invented by car companies, but by researchers at Cornell University, still doing a better job than Yale. Now, the Prime Minister has already gone ahead and listed plenty of bad innovations on the other side, and since he talks, I think, a bit faster than I, it seems I might be destined to lose that debate. But what he failed to address is that there is actually a difference between the types of innovations being created at public institutions and at private corporations. Universities will innovate even when there's no profit to be made. It comes in things like futurism. There's a reason that universities invented the internet and not companies, because nobody could have possibly imagined how this online site for researchers to talk could possibly have any profit in the future. It also happens in places where there's limited market value for innovations. Things like when we want to create vaccines that will be accessible to the poorest around the world, like are being researched at Harvard right now, people that can't afford to make a profit for companies, or drugs for rare diseases that don't have enough illnesses to be profitable for the companies that might create them. The unique value of a university is that they aim for the greater good. And we're seeing this now more than ever before. Coronavirus, for now, is possibly the greatest threat that we're seeing today. And the main drug that is our potential solution, remdesivir, is currently being trialed for the first time at the University of Nebraska in Omaha. When society faces us great challenges, we turn to universities, and time again, they have answered our call. But first, a comment from said government.
This debate is not about whether or not universities do more harm than good. If they simply functioned as public libraries, they do good. We told you it's a failure to discharge a specific duty, to be a place of knowledge and education without an agenda.
You're welcome to create your own burden if you want. It's unclear to me why universities can't have an agenda. The role of a university, to the contrary, is to have an agenda, to seek to create things that are very different from anything created outside of their institutions, and to make sure that those are having an impact on real people. And I believe that's what I'm trying to show you today. But we also haven't considered the very basic roles that universities provide. Our doctors, teachers, and lawyers are all educated in the halls of higher education. And people like lawyers even help with the research process. Scientists have even started using lawyers instead of lab rats because people get less attached to them, and some things even rats won't do. And many of these fields are expanding. Doctors today are better at their jobs than ever before because they're being trained at universities that are actively trying to make them better at their jobs for many of the perverse incentives that side government has proposed. For every investment banker that side proposition calls the failure of universities, there are a dozen authors, engineers, instructors, activists, and teachers that are making the world a better place every single day. Now, closing government is right to point out the danger of rising costs. I know better than most. As an American who's been in university for the better part of 2 years, my student debt is approaching the size of the Irish GDP. But I also know that there is no stock or bond that pays half the dividends that a good education can. That there is perhaps no greater equalizer of people than a university education. That scholarships and financial aid have never been as plentiful as they are today, and that the students who line the halls of institutions like Trinity College have never been more diverse or deserving. I'm incredibly proud to defend universities.
Thank you, Benjamin. We go now to the TCD team and called upon to propose that universities are failing society, Rory O'Sullivan.
Mr. Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, for decades the West was told that it lived in a world of historic possibility and change. Now it lives in a world of crisis, a democratic recession, an economy made for the few, and a climate heading for catastrophe. Our argument in first proposition is that at root, this crisis is a crisis of ideas, a crisis of dogma, and that universities are the institutions specifically designed by society for 1,000 years to pull societies away from the precipice in those such moments. There is a reason that the College Historical Society was founded as a part of Trinity and not as a part of like a badminton club or something. That universities are most able to meet that challenge of any group because they have that history, because their authority is respected as experts, but that more importantly, they have a duty to do this, because this is their most fundamental of purposes, and this is a time of most pressing need. In this Western world today, most universities have simply become, unfortunately, a mouthpiece for hegemonic thought, which long-term is sustaining the failure of the system of Western liberal democracy and capitalism. This debate is not about the presence of the universities and societies in different ways or different things it does for students or swimming pools that it gets them and then they have a free swimming pool. It is only about society and the fundamental questions and obligations about who we are and where we're going, and the role that the university has in shaping that discussion. I'm going to talk first of all about the opposition teams in general, then I'm going to ask the question of who is failing who, societies at the university, and I think you know what answer I will give, and those are the two things I'm going to do. So firstly, it's unsurprising in a way, given that this is a debate between people wearing suits and dresses, which features Harvard and Oxford, but the opposition, I think, exhibited every feature of that kind of hegemonic, scientism, progress-driven Western thought that we see. Their responses, first of all, they said, oh, there are student protests going on everywhere. Well, first of all, clearly they don't know about the developing world, which was the place that all of their examples came from, because every example that they gave was an instance of massive social upheaval in which everyone was involved in a protest, not just a student. But second, and also often in spite of universities, who in many of those countries are simply in the pockets of governments, particularly where those governments are dictatorships and those universities are not allowed to be free. Moreover, then, they said, oh, but universities teach people to challenge authority and do so on the basis of facts and information. You always, every one of you has authorities on the basis of which you make decisions in life, right? But the authority that universities give people, whether they're Western looking in the developing world or Western looking in the Western world, is one that says facts are facts, progress is progress, build the next machine and then everything will be better. Yeah, that is a higher authority than your parents or your prime minister, but that authority is still a massively damaging one if followed to the ends of the earth, which is what is happening now. The other point that I want to make to you about the opposition's cases is that they treated all innovation as completely inextricable. They want to make us a team who oppose all kinds of scientific innovation. That's absolutely not true at all. What we oppose is the belief that if you look into cures to diseases, you also have to look into facial recognition technologies and how to deceive people online. The fact is that scientists need to have a conversation about those things and research critically rather than uncritically. They told us that in a variety of ways the world is a very good place now, and I can't let them get away with it. It may be a very good place for us in this room, and indeed it is a very good place, if I may say so, but it's not for an awful lot of people. I mean, I don't think that anyone in this room probably is a Donald Trump voter, but the kind of deprivation that some of those people feel is something that should be taken seriously. And the other thing that I would point out is that even if the world is good now, it may be on a very bad trajectory, and we would tell you that in fact it is for the reasons that we've given you.
University, as I said, has taught me to question everything. For example, why are the other three teams only talking about wealthy Western nations?
I didn't hear the second half of that. If you're saying, I mean, culturally wealthy Western nation universities determine the culture of universities everywhere else because people imitate them, right? People want to be like MIT, so then they act like MIT. So we're talking about them a bit more, but that's because they're the leaders, which means that there are people behind them who they're leading. But they don't necessarily teach them to question everything. They teach them a way of looking at the world, like question everything. There has to be a framework within which you question things and a set of questions that you're asking. And in those are always grounded a set of assumptions. And those assumptions, we're saying, are bad ones, and universities are enforcing them. Then, this is the who is failing who part. Opposition told us in a variety of ways that societies are failing universities. The first point I'd make is that a lot of societies give universities a lot of money. They do it in funding, and they do it with the fees that students pay. Here, that amount may not be enough, but in the Netherlands, for example, it certainly is, so there isn't necessarily an excuse there. But why are societies often failing universities? Our answer is that the reason is ideological. It is a view of the world which places technology and the love of money before the love of wisdom. And to a great degree, universities enforce this with classrooms that are designed to instill people in certain faculties rather than teach them to question things and philosophize about the world, with a culture of employment that is completely corporate and that treats students as customers, with a funding model for research that prioritizes the discovery of the new over the getting wisdom from what's old. We got two sorts of responses to these answers. First of all, we were asked, well, what should universities do? This sounds very difficult and very expensive, what we're talking about. What we're talking about is actually easy, basic, and fundamental. Do not work on technology with governments like the Chinese government. Often, the money that you'll get from them is actually only for that specific project, so you won't lose out on too much, but take the hit if you do. Don't work on weapons with the Israeli military, and reward active involvement in society by your academics, and don't let them fall into narrow specialisms, which they have to do in order to keep innovating under the research model, the funding model that you give. In 2016, the year the English-speaking world finally realized everything was not going to be okay, people quoted Yeats, right? The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passion and intensity. But what we know now is that Yeats was wrong. More dangerous by far are the hidden, self-serving dogmas of the best, which sterilize passion and sedate intensity. We beg to propose.
Thank you, Rory. I now call upon the UCD Literary and Historical Society, Cora Keegan.
Panel, audience, Mr. Speaker. Everyone should be able to go to university, but right now, not everyone who needs to can, and right now, everyone who does often doesn't need to. Society is bleeding our universities dry, and we are expecting the same outcomes over and over again. Funding since the financial crash to universities has halved all over the world. In Ireland, UCD and Trinity used to get nearly 10 grand per student, and now they get less than 5. And we are expecting them to not turn to corporations for help. We are expecting them to not decide to look out for their universities financially. We have forced them to act like a business, and now Proposition are having a tantrum about them all acting like a business. The reality is, society has forced universities to be this way. Because society tells everyone they need to go to university, whether that's when they don't tell children in 6th year or in their leaving year about apprenticeships, and they don't tell them that you can actually become a plumber or an electrician and still be a valuable person, or whether it's your parents who are subconsciously told that you need to go into corporate jobs, or be it the jobs that push it on you themselves. Society in every angle tells everyone to go to college. We bottleneck them, we give them thousands of students every year and minimal amount of funding, and say go off and be a good boy and produce the most well-educated people. Obviously, I don't think anyone here is dumb and will be able to comprehend that that's not something we can continue to do. It's not how the world works. Our case is that it's not that the colleges choose to be bad, rather they were forced to make decisions, because we think Prop identifies some real problems in this debate. They just fail to acknowledge where they actually come from. Because universities in general are really very good at giving people an ability to move socially and climb that ladder once you're in those doors. Universities all over the world have scholarships. Trinity has the TAP program. University has the ALL program. It gives people the ability to climb that social mobility ladder and be just like everyone else and get a job that's well paying. Proposition can tell you that this is just corporate, like you're just making corporate robots, but to people who are in areas that are disadvantaged, it isn't a corporate robot. It's for the first time someone in your family has gone to an education, gets a job, and they're dependent on themselves rather than the state. That's important because universities all over the world, even when funding is decreasing, are still achieving that social mobility. They're still allowing people to climb that ladder. It isn't just the people who are wealthy that are going in, because even in times of crisis, universities all over the world still to some extent prioritize that social mobility. They still to some extent value that. We think that is incredibly important and probably a good thing that is going on in universities. Then we get this idea that universities should question society. I think maybe presidents of universities like Andrew Deeks, and I'm very sorry I don't know the name of Trinity's one because they don't have a cool New Zealand accent like Deeks, but maybe presidents all over the world don't have an inclination to question society because they have to beg for money to continue to do what they do. But they still have TAs, they still have lab demonstrators, they still have people all over the world who continue to question. Because repeal wasn't made up of loads of students for no reason. It isn't a coincidence that students bought into that idea. It isn't a coincidence that students protested for marriage equality, and it's not a coincidence that students all over America are fighting for gun control rights. It is that we question... in a sec. No, actually, just go, whatever.
Given the power what universities produce has to influence society, presumably it would actually have been better if they rejected corporate research, if the research was just going to find things that supported them and went against actual social goods.
Right, so rejecting that corporate funding looks like asking the students to pay more in fees, which goes against your case. Rejecting that funding means that you don't get the scholarships like TAP. Rejecting that funding means that they lock out people from society. Universities are doing their best. It's not perfect, but they're doing something good. Because students, back to the point, students still question. The people in universities question all the time. It's why LGBTQ societies and colleges in general are way more accepting of social norms. Because students here are very passionate, and I don't think it's a coincidence. Because they say that we're just robots in society and we'll never question, but I don't actually think that's true. There's a reason in universities, like there is always a society to question something. There's a reason there is a feminist society in most colleges. There's a reason there's people who are locked out who can create societies. And that is because those people can collectively come together and question. Whether it's the whole university or not doesn't matter, because it allows them a safe space or a space that is relatively safe for them to question those things. It doesn't have to be as huge or as dramatic as everyone in a university questioning. Because we are reliant on corporations. I don't understand, I actually genuinely can't comprehend what the prop would rather universities do. If I'm a shop and the customers are no longer shopping in my shop, I either change what I sell and change how I sell it, or I close it down, or I stop stocking as much as I do. It means I no longer fund a new lab that can do all the research that needs to be done with vaccines or coronavirus.
Question?
It means no, thank you. It means I close down the academics for the room for politics. It means I no longer have those things, but those things are crucial to university and they're crucial to people how interact. The Ashling's case is literally universities are struggling and they're putting it on the students, but they are struggling because societies have forced them to struggle. That is incredibly important. Then we get this really weird case that academics were once the average Joe Soap. I just don't think this is true. Even if we go way back to ancient Greece or something, like Aristotle, which is pronounced like Chipotle, I don't know if you're aware, you must have all been saying it wrong in your heads a long time ago, wasn't a man of the people. You can tell yourself all you like he was, but he wasn't. He was the upper echelon of Greek society. No matter how far back we go, they were always the people in charge. At least now they're letting women in. At least now they're letting people who are minorities in. The reality is we force universities to act like a business. We bleed them dry and we give them little to no money and thousands of students every year, and we say, off you go, do your best. Create students who will be knowledgeable with a niche skill set. Mr. Speaker, society tells everyone to go to uni. Society doesn't care about the process of how you learn or how you come out of university. They just want that 1%, the nice, shiny person who can come out and be a millionaire, the nice, shiny person who is going to be the upper echelon, the sexy, sensational graduate, rather than the people who can actually create change. And that is because society has bled them dry and not allowed them to fund what they need to fund. I beg you to oppose.
Thank you, Cora. I now call upon, from the UCD L&H, Aisling Tully. And she will propose the motion.
Universities, and those who work in them, are public servants. That means they should work for us, and not just the people in this room, the people outside this room as well. But what can we thank the Irish university system for? There's the mumps revival, thanks for that. There's students top-to-tailing in beds because of sky-high rents. And there's the closure of Lemon on Dawson Street. Now that wasn't technically their fault, but they should have done more to prevent that because students have really suffered. But that's not the only account they failed us, though. The building you were in tonight is kept lit, is kept sort of heated, by taxpayer money. It's paid for by people. It's paid for by opportunities. And that money could have gone somewhere else. It could have been spent on someone else, but it was spent on universities. The universities owe the people who paid that money, the people who would otherwise receive that money, a duty, and they have failed in that duty. We're not saying that universities are bad or that they produce bad people, but they do hold the keys to the halls of power, and they hold the answers to the important questions. And the way that universities have developed in the world that we live in today prevents people from accessing those important facts. I'm going to just deal with what first opposition tell us in terms of why society has failed universities and not vice versa before I talk about activism in universities and why universities have failed us on that account. Because they tell us that society are the people who tell everyone they should go to university, and it's not universities' fault that everyone rocks up at their doors. Universities expand their courses. They tell people they need to go to university. They make spaces for thousands of people in UCD Arts that don't have access to contact hours and don't have access to lecturers who can talk them through when they're struggling. They make those opportunities happen. That's not because society says, we'll send you to your room if you don't. It's because they want the money of the people who they're accepting in. They take on that burden because they want people to pay for access to opportunities, and they sell them those opportunities, but fail to deliver on those opportunities. Maybe, fair enough, society tells people that the more education you have, the better it is. But universities tell us we will be the people who can give you that education, and we will be the people who can give you those jobs. And then they do not give them that education, and they do not give you those jobs. And so, therefore, universities are complicit, and in fact, do ultimately fail students and society in that respect. Let's talk about activism in universities, because people in this debate got confused. We're not opposed to more people going to university on proposition. We're also not opposed to student protest. We think that both of those things are good. What we explained is that in the status quo, when universities have ultimately decided to sell out in the interest of getting more money, making them a profit-making business, instead of focusing on their obligation to students, that they have failed, and that they have been bought, and that this has stopped those things from happening. It has stopped us caring about providing for the more students we let in our doors, and it has stopped us caring for providing for the students who ultimately want to protest. Opposition tell us that change happens because you have research and good international standards, and you learn from other regions, and you have academics advising government. When universities funnel their resources into providing answers for market research, when they sell themselves to Accenture and consulting companies and other agendas, when they create students and courses that are literally tailored to making sure that you walk right out of your university into a specific workplace, they stop that from happening. There are no academics in existential philosophy advising the government, and that means universities don't necessarily have an interest in funding research in that area. They tell people to publish along certain lines. They hire academics who are qualified in certain fields, and they neglect the rest of the questions that are important in this world. They reject the rest of the issues that are not discussed by corporate interests. That means when you don't have the availability of lessons or academics to talk to, when students don't have time to be active or to protest because they're working part-time or they're traveling 4 hours while also trying to get to university, you don't have the protests, you don't have the new ideas, you don't have the people who care so deeply about their discipline, and it's something different and it's something challenging, because universities shut that down at the moment, that they listen to the interests that don't want to hear those voices. First opposition, off you go.
So if you are a university and you have a society that is telling everyone they need to have a university degree and a society that cuts your funding, how do you make up that gap?
So what has happened at the moment is universities have decided they're going to fill up that funding by ultimately funding things that are not in the interest of the students that they reject, that are not in the interest of the underprivileged students that they do accept, and miss classes or have to work uptime and not be able to do well in their degrees. So ultimately we feel that if you are given the choice between letting more people in or having, letting more people in or having more socially good aims in terms of what you're fulfilling, you should choose the thing that achieves more social good, because that will ultimately pay off for other people as opposed to selling out to corporate interests. To be clear, we want change. We want protest, we want conversation, we want hard questions, we want research that's important, and we want academics that will speak out, not in journals, in public. And that doesn't happen on their side of the house, because those students are shut out, and those academics are fighting to meet KPIs. And this is a cycle that doesn't end, because the government doesn't fund you if all of your money comes from external revenue, because they don't think they have to anymore. They think you're sufficient. And when that sufficiency goes into building institutes instead of funding student economy accommodation, you don't get that student accommodation built, because who builds it? Accenture isn't funding student halls, it's funding lecture theatres that people can't go to because they're working part-time, and that doesn't achieve any of the things for underprivileged people they say that they talk about. Universities also have an obligation to make unique contributions. This is significant in a world where corporate and political interests dominate. The reality is, if we have to choose between forcing people into careers and letting no one in, but introducing ideas that can change people's lives, we would rather that happen. Universities have a job to protect us. They should speak out about climate change. They should speak out about human rights. They should speak out about the refugee crisis, not just to one student, to the world, to society, to the people outside these doors and outside these walls, and that isn't happening right now. When Elizabeth Warren published a book on clever economics for the everyday person, that's what universities should do. They shouldn't be publishing in journals. They shouldn't be pushed towards market incentives, and universities every day are selling out more and more to companies that force them to do that. When we can't access their ideas, they don't inform us, and we don't always have the solutions that opposition talk about. And that's why the Irish people, when they were told they were rescued from debt, didn't appreciate it, because they didn't see it. What good are academics in ivory towers? What good is recovery that you don't feel? It means nothing to people. They become cynical. They become afraid of elites. They become afraid of the information that can save their lives. Universities have an obligation to protect their students. They have an obligation to protect their academics, and they have an obligation to protect society. They are failing on all those accounts at the moment. Proud to propose.
Thank you, Aisling. Now the final speaker from the Oxford Union is Jack Solomon, and he will oppose the motion that universities are failing society.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's getting late, and the Irish segment of this debate is sadly over. So what I'm going to do to spice things up to kind of end the night is every time I'm offered a POI and I don't want it, I'm going to tell you a fun fact about Ireland from natgeokids.com. In the meantime, I'm going to first offer you some rapid-fire responses to the kind of educational outcome points that we get from the government bench. And then I'm going to show why universities actually go above and beyond in fulfilling their social obligations. And if we win on both of those, I think we quite clearly win the debate. So firstly, rapid-fire responses to educational outcomes. The first claim that comes out of government bench is that university research is being misused. And I think this is a silly argument, and Oscar explains why. Obviously, the buck has to stop somewhere on the causal chain. So if TCD developed a new and faster rapid assault rifle and gave it to Al-Qaeda, TCD is failing society. Like, that is bad. But if TCD develops facial recognition software that is used by technology companies that makes your life easier, that's used by security companies to identify potential threats in society, and then after the patent on that expires, many years down the line, that's abused by the Chinese government, like Steve Bannon and Xi Jinping team up and abuse humanity, that's not on TCD and that's not on universities. That isn't the university failing society. The first fact, Ed Sheeran is actually not Irish. And so the conclusion there is that university research is possibly being misused, but that does not prove that universities are failing society. I can't do fun facts every time, no thank you. Secondly, closing government say that universities aren't what they used to be. They now do things like sell out to corporate donors and use KPIs and other evil things. Oscar explains that they can't have their cake and eat it too. So you could either have like more subsidies and more classes or lower fees, but it's impossible to have both. Or you could have intellectualism, or you could have teaching employable basic trade skills, but you can't have both. Similarly, you can have more money or you can have, Chinese funding, but you can't have both. And so it would be true that if you had neither of the things on either side of that trade-off, then yes, universities are failing. But if as closing government say you get one of those two things, then clearly universities aren't failing. They're just picking one thing that maybe one of the Ashlings doesn't like. Thirdly, I'll do a fun fact before the third one. Ireland is actually an island. I actually only discovered that recently. universities may be failing me. Thirdly, and this is the point that comes from the individual speech, university students don't go into the real world enough. Obviously, you would think that if you were a philosophy student, but if you were, for example, a medicine student, you would end up in placement in a hospital. If you're a scientist, you would do experiments in the real world. If you did politics, you would study data about elections in the real world, and then probably publish op-eds in, Vox.com if you're American or elsewhere if you're not American. So it's not true to say that educationally universities are failing. And so if the metric that you judge this debate on is like, are universities performing to their educational standards that they should be? The answer is yes, and we've won the debate. But the second and more interesting part of this debate is, do universities fulfill their social obligations? Before I move on to that, I will take opening.
You say that the people who develop facial recognition software are not responsible if the Chinese government misuses it. Our argument is that that generally accepted idea is a really dangerous one and should not be possessed by universities. They are responsible for that if they research uncritically.
So I just kind of deny that a university where you've got legal scholars input, you've got technologists input, you've got a whole lot of different input, and your patent eventually expires and you don't have any causal responsibility, is to blame when the Chinese government uses the technology that you have created for evil deeds when in the rest of the world it's being used for social goods. I think it's a bit of an unreasonable burden to say that universities have to ensure that none of what they do ever gets to Xi Jinping's desk, because if it does, it in theory could be misused. Why is it that universities go above and beyond their obligations socially? And here's where the debate goes on this kind of strand. Open and government give you a sort of stream of consciousness that doesn't have much analysis about the good old days when people stood up to authority at universities and protested a lot. And opening opposition says, well, that's true, but that's society's fault, not universities' fault. Oscar actually gives you the crucial link, which is that universities today actually more than ever do engage in social activism and political activism. And importantly, this argument not only applies in Western countries, which is really where the bulk of the rest of the debate happens, it also, in addition to that, applies in the developing world where the majority of the world's people live and the majority of the world's people go to university. And Oscar's argument goes like this, and I want to reiterate it because I think most of it goes unresponded. He firstly explains the following. 1, universities equip students with information, often information they will not otherwise have got. So for example, in non-democracies, governments have incentives to distribute information within universities because they need innovation to support domestic industries because they don't have trade. So for example, in Chile, students were equipped with a lot of economic tools, and that is how they found economic evidence of corruption in Chile, and that is when the protests began. Similarly, in democracies, governments have incentives to produce educational outcomes, for example, to get a skilled workforce. So in India, for example, law students and law schools were where many of the protests started when law students realized that the identity laws that the Indian government were putting in place were actually very discriminatory. That all started at universities because they uniquely gave students information. No thanks. Secondly, he explains that students are still critical at universities, and that's still true. I think that's very trivially obvious. And thirdly, and most importantly and interestingly, Oscar explains that universities are still outstandingly good at being able to mobilize social movements, if anything more so than they were before. Firstly, universities are seen as prestigious and important in society, so people listen when there are demonstrations there. A good example of that is the University of Cape Town, which is seen as very prestigious in South Africa. When that was shut down because students said, we're not willing to continue paying ridiculously high fees if our government is corrupt and not subsidizing it, fees went down, universities got better. So actually, society was improved as a result of activism that uniquely occurred at universities. Secondly, academics are often advisors and publicly relevant, and this is a very good example and I think demonstrates sort of the best part of our case. Indian students in India asked law professors whether they would be willing to help with legal cases against unjustly imprisoned protesters. They then compiled a list of legal professors who said yes and messaged that to people on WhatsApp. That was then used to make sure that people were not unjustly prosecuted. That was a critical form of activism that would not have existed bar universities. That's why universities, both educationally and socially, are fulfilling their goals and are helping society, and why you should stand not with the Irish, but with us.
Hello, I I just want to thank you all for coming and for watching the debate, especially to our judges and to our speakers, both in the final and not. And now we're going to invite the judges just to retire to the room on their right over there. Well, there we'll find tables and chairs and such, and to invite everybody else to stretch their legs for a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you.